I think that when the revised employment data comes out, people are going to be shocked that actually employment fell last year. When you look at retail sales in nominal numbers last year, up to the first 11 months, they rose by 2.4%. But what did CPI do? Rose by 3%. So even even taking CPI, then you had negative retail sales last year. The problem is that CPI is thoroughly manipulated. You talk to any household, the wife who does the weekly or the monthly shopping will tell you inflation is very much higher than that. If you use the unmanipulated data going back to the 1970s that John Williams of Shadow Government Stats does, inflation this year so far has averaged 10.8%. So, I mean, even saying that the figure is 5%, that's a pretty big drop on retail sales. And we'll probably see retail sales in the early months of next year being revised down. So there are all sorts of complications to the economic data. But I think there is two other matters that we need to address. The first is that the revisions in the employment data will be produced by the BLS in February, and that is bound to show a very sharp revision downwards. And since the Philly Fed does a regular assessment of the employment data themselves, and not so long ago, they came out with a revised figure for the year ending March this year. And when the BLS revised their data, it was absolutely smack on, 800,000 down. They are now saying for the second quarter that employment fell, whereas the BLS is saying rose by 1.1%. So the economic chips that we will see in the first 6 to 9 months of next year are not going to be good. But there is another element, and an important one, which is that, I'm just getting my notes, which is that there's probably going to be a deliberate policy by the Trump government to take a lot of the fat out of the economy in order to have a sounder base from which they can grow the economy and grow prosperity. For instance, Elon Musk on the 29th of October said, "We have to reduce spending to live within our means, and that necessarily involves some temporary hardship, but will ensure long-term prosperity." So we've got to have a solid base before we can produce the better things for everybody. So on our cycle work, we will see a weak global economy in the first 6 to 9 months of next year. By when the fiscal and monetary stimuli, which Trump and others will introduce, will start a 2-year boom in equities, in business activity, and in commodity markets. The problem is that it will be accompanied by rising inflation. And what we see as we go through 2027 and into 2028, we will see a repeat of the inflation process that we experienced in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what does that imply? If US CPI is around 13% and global inflation around 15%, what are long-term bonds going to yield? US 10-year treasuries will be yielding over 10%. What is that going to do to a highly leveraged debt system? It's going to be the end of this particular cycle, and we go into rolling recessions or even depression. So how does the frictions or the wars being seen in Europe and the Middle East, how do they fit into the scenario? It's very possible that the Trump administration, who don't want wars, will do what they can to prevent the wars from escalating. So let's start with what's going on in Europe.
Simon, can I briefly interrupt you before we get to
Yeah,
geopolitics? Just before
sure.
we get to geopolitics, because that I've got so many questions about geopolitics. I just don't want to get too far away from the economics and the economy that you've touched on, because you mentioned last week was sort of a trigger, like the markets were strong until last week. What did you mean by? I just want to follow up on that and get some clarity on that. What did you see in the market? What changed?
What changed was the hawkish tone that Powell introduced in his Q&A session. And it started, the markets have been overbought, overvalued. It only needed a small trigger, and that was the trigger. And I think this is what will come from that trigger will be over the 6 to 9 months, so not day to day, but over the next 6 to 9 months, you'll see, for instance, the S&P falling by about 20%, the FANGs by about 40%, and that then lays the foundations for the next big move up, which will take us into 2027, and then we see the collapse.
Okay. No, I was curious because I keep wondering why the market expected a rate cut, telling after Powell was telling everybody that they're data dependent, right? And he did cut, but the question is
What
what is he
data?
seeing? There's obviously something that made him nervous, and
Well,
it.
it's I mean, what we have seen has only been the low hanging fruit that have gone into failures or bankruptcies. For the bigger fruit, it takes longer for them to fail because they have other options, other funding options. It's only when those funding options are exhausted do they fail. And it's maybe that's what he's seeing in the undergrowth of the financial system.
One thing he mentioned that surprised me a little bit because he kept using the word data dependency in the past. Now he said, "Oh, we have committees and maybe subcommittees that are looking at future policy scenarios," which surprised me a little bit that he's taken that into account because he never admitted to anything like that. I think we might have talked about that as well. Like, is Powell taking geopolitics into account? Like, what is happening outside of the U.S.? Is he taking that into account for his the Fed funds rate? And he was never clear on it. He always said data dependent. We'll use, as you said, the jobs data. We'll use the PCE numbers. And we'll base it on that. But now he seems to be forward looking and trying to be proactive about things, talking about tariffs and inflation, for example, based on what the new or the president-elect might do come January 20th. I was a bit surprised to hear that. Were you as well?
I think he's become more realistic. There is a new administration coming in with a new guy. He's expressed a lot of measures he's going to introduce, and tariffs. What do tariffs do? Tariffs do two things. They're inflationary, and at the same time, because they're inflationary, they are they take money away out of the pockets of the average household. So it's a very confusing picture. Hence why I quoted Elon Musk, who obviously has a big influence on policy, why I quoted him, because they understand we can only grow prosperity by taking a lot of the silly stuff out of the system first. So that's why first half next year, first 9 months next year, are going to be tough. Markets falling, economic weakness. Europe is not in a good place. Japan is hardly in a good place. China is actually in a better place, but their recovery won't start until the second half of the year.